I'm Dave Hardy, and welcome again to Say What. I'm a West Virginian born and bred, and nothing is more important in our state than the ability to plan for emergencies, particularly flood emergencies. And we have a history of those in our state. And that's why I'm so glad today to have as my guest Mr. James Young. James, you are the District Field Coordinator for Region 3 of FEMA, correct?
Yes, sir. The team lead for the West Virginia FEMA integration team here in Charleston.
And that, again, how many times have you heard the word FEMA in your lifetime? Well, today our guest is a face of FEMA here in Charleston and here in West Virginia. And better yet, he's a native of Kanawha County. So James, tell me what got you into this field.
Wow, so thinking back, I never dreamed I'd be working in emergency management or for FEMA, but for a lot of people, 2016 was that moment where everything changed. And so at the time I was working for the Kanawha County Commission, and we had the huge flood that impacted Clendenin and a lot of the county, and I was told, go help. And I didn't know what that meant at the time.
You just got in the car and went?
Exactly. Went up there, started working on the debris mission, was helping the town of Clendenin with the recovery.
Wait a minute. You got to tell me something. What is a debris mission?
So that is where all the debris is put out on the curbside.
Okay.
And it's picked up. In some cases, it's put in a giant pile, then it's taken to the landfill. So making sure that residents who are flooded, they can have all their debris taken care of by, a county or a city, so it's one less thing to worry about.
Now, you're originally from here in the Kanawha County area, right?
That's correct.
What high school did you go to?
I went to Fairhaven Christian School, actually, up Campbell's Creek.
Okay.
So always been a Kanawha County resident and live in the city now. So always knew flooding was a threat, even as a young kid, grew up in Sissonville and seeing some of the flooding that occurred there.
And where did you attend college?
I got my undergrad at Marshall University and then got a master's in city management from East Tennessee State in Johnson City.
So you're planning your career, you're working for the county. We have the historic 2016 floods on Elk River, which, it's hard to believe that's been 7 years ago now. You go up there and your eyes are opened, is that right?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people, when they think about FEMA, they think of that emergency response and those initial phases, but I got into the recovery and seen what it meant to really help people through such a troubling time. And it's not something that will be fixed in a matter of days or weeks or months. I mean, this is a years and years process. So I started to see the other side of FEMA, the long-term recovery aspect of it. And I think due to the magnitude of that disaster, FEMA was at a point where they were going to open up a long-term recovery office, knowing that this is going to take years to recover. And even now in 2023, we're looking at still recovery efforts going on. So at that point, FEMA started hiring local staff, and that's where I found an opportunity and been here ever since.
Isn't that funny how sometimes, and it's hard to explain this to young people, sometimes you just have to be in the position to see the opportunity. Absolutely. You don't know where it's coming from, but it comes.
Yeah, and it's one of those things at the time you don't know if it's the right choice, you don't know how long it's going to last. But here again, I am over 6-7 years later, and there's always something going on in West Virginia. I know that much.
That is the truth. Tell me, when did you go to work for FEMA?
So I started in 2017, and at that point we were doing a long-term recovery mission. There were still people who were in temporary housing. There was still no real plan for what the schools were going to look like. Local communities were still trying to figure out what the future was going to hold, because a lot of times after a disaster, that can be the death knell of a community. That could be, but it's also an opportunity to reinvent yourself and say that, we were heading this direction, but now due to this flood, we've got to look at something else. And I think, like in Clendenin's case, focus on recreation and outdoor activities has been, a lifesaver in some ways to that community, because they weren't heading that path in the first place.
Right. So out of tragedy comes rebirth.
Yep.
To use a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. It's real.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of eyes on communities after disasters. There's a lot of money coming in. And I've always thought that's an opportunity that doesn't come very often. I know with COVID, that was another round of a lot of funding coming in. But the communities that really have success in recovery utilize that attention, utilize that funding, and really leverage money to create a new future.
So now, as we sit here today, it's been 6 years. Mm-hmm. Tell me about your career progression with FEMA here in West Virginia.
Yeah, so I started off as the long-term recovery lead for FEMA, which is really working with local communities to say, okay, now this has happened, what are your priorities? What are the strategies you want to employ to, it could be reducing flood risk, it could be economic development, it can be infrastructure improvement. So putting together a plan to now say, okay, how can we leverage other federal funding or philanthropic dollars, private dollars to see this in reality? So I did that for a couple of years, and then almost 2 years ago, I was promoted to the team lead for the West Virginia team. And so now I oversee the office of close to 30 people, work day in and day out here in West Virginia. And so not only are we looking at recovery, but also we are an option for response. So if there is an activation at the State Emergency Operations Center, we support that. And so we're supporting all phases of emergency management, from response, recovery, the mitigation, which is so important, but also preparedness, which is key as well, to make sure that we know that it's a reality that it's always going to be flooding and there's going to be disasters. So how do we be best prepared for that?
So FEMA has 30 employees just in the state of West Virginia full time.
That is correct, and that is very unique to the rest of the country. And back in 2019, they came up with this concept called the FEMA integration team, which is let's embed FEMA staff during blue sky days to build relationships and work with states on preparedness so that when something happens, we're ready to go. We don't have to wait for somebody to deploy from another state, or we're halfway across the country. So we're working day in and day out so that when something happens, we already have those relationships. We know how to work with the state. We have that rapport built so that we can go ahead and start helping residents as quickly as possible.
So it's very proactive.
Absolutely.
Now, your District 3, I take it that District 3 is a district within the overall organization of FEMA.
Yeah, there are 11 regions within FEMA, and Region 3 is pretty much the Mid-Atlantic. Our regional office is in Philadelphia, and it's a lot of the states there bordering. And so West Virginia is the most active state in Region 3.
Now, when you say most active, that's not necessarily a good thing, right?
No, in terms of declarations. So
Right.
we know that when you watch the news that it's flooding somewhere just about any time it rains. But for FEMA, we have certain indicators and thresholds that have to be met before we come in with federal assistance for a presidentially declared disaster. And so with that being the case, West Virginia has about 2 a year. And their 2016 was that huge disaster, but a lot of cases we're talking disasters that are under $15 million in damage, which is significant at the local level. But if you know anything about FEMA, you see the $1 billion, the wildfires and the hurricanes. And so they don't get a lot of the media attention, but they impact residents in West Virginia nonetheless.
What surprised me so much, James, about the 2016 Elk River floods was the speed of FEMA. Because frankly, I had a government stereotype. The federal government is so big that I assumed that when FEMA came, it would be a slow process. It was like you blinked your eyes and FEMA was there. How does that work?
So what we're looking at for the most part is when it exceeds capacity at the local or state level. And that is a judgment call in some ways. But in 2016, it happened so fast, there was fatalities, there's so much that the state was overwhelmed right from the get-go. In your more traditional flooding that occurs, sometimes that doesn't happen right away. So we're always on standby. If there's a hurricane coming up the East Coast, we are pre-positioned just in case it could come inland and hit West Virginia, or it could hit the coast of Virginia, ready to support. But we don't do anything without the state requesting in the first place. We would never self-deploy. So that's where the key relationship is with the state, to know that, what are you thinking? How much impact do you think this could happen? But in West Virginia, there's also those no-notice events. So we know it's going to rain, and it rains a whole lot more than we expected, and then all of a sudden the water's gone. So in West Virginia, it's not your traditional where you see the hurricane coming and have time to prepare.
Right.
It's that bang kind of situation. And then we have to really mobilize quickly to help the state and the residents.
Yeah, and I think you're drawing a contrast. In Florida, you may turn on the news and they may know 5 days ahead of time that a tropical storm is approaching Florida.
Yep.
In West Virginia, how much advance notice do you get of one of these unusual rain cells that can deliver 6-7 inches of rain in 30-40 minutes? How often do you get notice of that?
It does not happen very often. I know for the flooding we had just a couple weeks back, we knew it was going to rain, but we had no idea it was going to drop so much rain in so quick of a time. We have staff and meteorologists looking at that stuff all the time, and we have a great partnership with the National Weather Service, so we do our best to stay ahead of it, but those are the hardest ones to predict. But there are cases where hurricanes can come inland and flood West Virginia and stall and do things like that, and those are the ones that give us a little more time to be pre-positioned, but that's certainly not common in the state.
Let me try to draw a contrast and try to draw down some of the things you've been saying. The Elk River flood was so big, the national FEMA organization came in quickly, right?
Exactly, yep.
Now contrast that to the recent floods, Slaughters Creek, West Virginia, Shillian area, or the Smithers floods from a year or two back in the Montgomery area. Does the federal government come in, or do you handle that locally?
So we are always in contact with the state and saying, do you need anything? Is there any assistance we can provide? But for those smaller events where the water, comes in quickly and it's gone, a lot of times it starts locally, and it's up to the locals to do their damage assessments to know, okay, how many houses were impacted? Was there any infrastructure? Was City Hall flooded? To get those numbers and start to accumulate some data. They then work with the state to validate that, to see, is it going to meet the threshold of a FEMA declaration? Because we have a lot of data and know what it takes, but we don't come in until they're pretty sure that there is enough damage to meet that threshold. So today's a perfect example of the flooding that occurred up Slaughters Creek and Winifred Holler. We're out there today doing assessments because the locals did their part, they validated with the state, and now we're coming in to kind of put a bow on it to say, okay, these are the numbers. And that'll allow the state to then make a decision if it has met the threshold for the governor to submit a declaration request to the president.
Okay, so one core principle seems to be it all starts local.
Absolutely.
And who is local? Is it county government? Is it state government? Who is it?
It can be a variety. We typically look at the emergency management agency at the county or the municipal level. But we know in West Virginia, a lot of times people wear multiple hats. So it could be the mayor, it could be a council, it could be trash collectors. So
right.
It's kind of all hands on deck in a lot of cases. But we're used to working with the emergency managers in each county. Of course, the state does as well. But there's a variety of partners that can come out. It just really is based on the magnitude and what kind of capacity the community has.
Do all 55 counties of West Virginia have a designated emergency manager for the county?
They do. Some are full-time, some are part-time. I mean, so it kind of varies on, again, that capacity level. But there's also a lot of great, partnership in the state that if one county's impacted, everybody else chips in. It's that West Virginia resiliency that you see a lot of times. So even if somebody is devastated and they don't have a full-time staff, it's a lot of people come in and try to help. And
it's astonishing.
Yeah.
I was reading recently, Mayor Cavalier from Smithers had written a piece recently about the flood at Smithers, which I think was roughly a year ago or thereabouts. And she was talking about not just government, but outside charitable groups had just shown up. And I think that happened at Elk River as well.
And that is one of the most amazing things I see in West Virginia is that nonprofit, faith-based organizations that come in and help. And the West Virginia Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, West Virginia VOAD, is such a key part in all elements of emergency management in West Virginia. They are the ones who are helping with the muck out of homes. They're the ones that are replacing bridges, getting those unmet needs, because FEMA provides assistance in some cases when it rises to a certain level, but it's never enough. And so it really takes everybody pitching together, and that nonprofit side, the volunteers that come in are so important in a state like West Virginia because there's just always such a need, and everybody banding together is what's really important.
Now, this is National Preparedness Month, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Tell me about that.
So we always say it's never too early to be prepared. It is the middle of hurricane season now. It floods in West Virginia a lot. But what we try to message to people is have plans, have emergency plans in your home that if you needed to evacuate at its moment's notice, do you have stuff ready? Do you have prescriptions identified? Do you have things like batteries and flashlights and things like that? Do you have perishable food already set aside? But also, how protected are you from the insurance perspective? Because
that's a good point.
Yeah, flood insurance is that first line of defense after any event.
And people, it's like all other insurance policies. You don't want to use it.
Yep.
But nowadays, there's such a push to get homeowners to have flood insurance.
Yeah, and I think right now in West Virginia, I think the percentage of having homeowners or having the flood insurance is about 14 to 16%. So it's very low. But if you're talking about true recovery, that is what is going to help people to rebuild to the standards that they want to. Because even if FEMA does come in and provide assistance, it's not going to be enough to truly recover. And so that's why we always promote flood insurance. And I know sometimes it can be expensive.
It is expensive.
And that's the reality of it. But we always try to message that as much as possible, knowing that that is a true sign of whether you're going to have a successful recovery or not. Is, are you insured to the right level?
I'm going to ask a wild question. Probably doesn't have an answer, but I'll ask
Okay.
it anyway. It just popped in my head. Has there ever been an analysis of what percentage of West Virginia residences are in a floodplain?
There is, and
That's amazing.
It is. I mean, and one of the best tools we have in the state is the West Virginia Flood Tool, and you can go in there and you can put an individual address. You can
What's the website for that?
If you Google West Virginia Flood Tool.
Just WV Flood Tool
Yes.
or West Virginia Flood Tool?
Yeah, and that is used by insurance agents. It's used by emergency managers to know what is your risk. And it is one of the best flood tools in the country. And you can go in and you can see how close you are to the floodplain or the floodway.
So you put your address in and it shows you right there.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a great tool. I'm going to do that tonight from my home.
And it even has these inundation maps to show you that under a 100-year flood or 500-year flood, this is how much water you would have in your property.
When the term 100-year flood and 500-year, those terms are used a lot. What exactly do they mean?
It is the likelihood of that occurring in a given year. It is not saying that it will happen every 100 years or 500 years.
See, there's a misconception.
There is.
People say, well, I'm in the 100-year floodplain. That means in 100 years it might flood one
Yes.
time.
Yeah, it is.
What does it mean? If you say you're in the 100-year floodplain, what does that mean?
It's saying that there is a certain percentage for that 100-year flooding amount to occur in any given year. And so the percentages are low, but I mean, in some it's more often than others. But it is something that I think a lot of people struggle with to understand exactly what that means. And they think, well, it happened now, so it won't happen for another 100 or 500
That's right. If it
years.
happened this year, it won't happen for 99 more
But
years.
we are seeing the number of disasters, the magnitude of disasters keep getting higher. So it is something that is going to happen more often, definitely not less.
You know, James, back to your comment there about being prepared. I've recently sought out 2 people that were in floods because I wanted to understand it. One was Mayor Summers in Clendenin, and I asked her, I said, describe for me what it was like when your house flooded the day of the Clendenin Elk River floods. And it's kind of stunning because in my mind, when you think of a house flooding, someone looks out and says, oh, wow, there's some water coming. But, gather up your things and get your prescriptions and get, pick up your stuff. And it doesn't happen that way, apparently.
No.
Apparently, when the water comes, 1 minute it's dry and the next minute it's up to your knees or your waist. It's that quick.
And especially for people in the low-lying areas. I mean, if you look at development in West Virginia, historically we have developed along the creeks and streams.
Yes.
And now we have a better understanding of what that risk is. So that is why it's so important to have floodplain ordinances in communities so that when you do new construction or you make any renovations that you are elevating out of that. Because if you are in these lower-lying areas and not elevated, that water comes even quicker and you don't have much time to prepare. And you look at a community like Clendenin today and you see the house on stilts, that is the true elevation of where the flood risk is and where most development should be. But in West Virginia, we have a lot of home ownership that has gone from generation to generation. And so they've never had mortgages or things like that. So therefore, the insurance hasn't been required or they haven't had to elevate.
Well, that's right. I mean, how we view this subject today is totally different than how we viewed it even maybe in the 1960s or 70s.
Absolutely.
I mean, now, are we having more floods in West Virginia? Has that been studied? Are we having more today versus 20 years ago?
I think nationally we are seeing more disasters and more severe. And if you look at some of the projections for precipitation over the next however many years, West Virginia is an area that is expected to get wetter. So, not only is it coming up from the creeks and streams, but it is that runoff. It is the flash flooding that occurs that can really surprise people in a lot of cases. So we know, I don't know that, we know how many presidential declarations there have been, and that's been fairly consistent. But in terms of that nuisance flooding, the localized flooding that occurs anytime it rains, I think that's definitely something worth looking at.
Does anybody understand these weather cells at all, or are the meteorologists completely befuddled by them?
You know, that's a tough question.
That's a really hard question.
It is.
Probably unfair for me to ask you that, but it is amazing when you hear someone say, it rained a little bit at my house, but 10 miles away, it rained 5 inches.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, how does that happen?
And you know, the technology we have with the radar system keeps getting better. But to your point, you can be barely separated, and it can be a matter of a couple inches to, you know, over 5 or 7 inches. And even the flooding that occurred a couple weeks ago, it's amazing to see how one ridge line over, the difference in water, and that would be impossible, I think, to predict from a meteorologist standpoint. Yet they do the best they can.
As far as home preparedness, is there a website in particular that a person should look at to check off on their home preparedness?
Yeah, ready.gov has a lot of different pages. It has things for elderly populations. It has stuff for kids. It has things for families of how you can be best prepared. There's checklists, there are guides. There's a lot of just great information that is easily digestible and can be printed out, just to make sure people understand, you know, what they need to be thinking about. Because in West Virginia, we look at flooding a lot, but if you look at other parts of the country, you know, wind is more of an issue, or earthquakes in some part of the country. So each region of the country has their own unique threats and challenges. And so the website's a great overview of everything that we could face, knowing that we used to not get a lot of wind in West Virginia, but now, here recently, it seems like the straight line wind is occurring more often, and the derecho of, what was that, 2014 that occurred. You know, you just never know what may be coming next.
No, it's been close to a decade since the derecho, but I am still mentally, in my mind, I can still see it pass through.
Yeah.
Because I had a good view of it coming right toward South Hills, and I still can't believe it, what I saw. It was like a band of extreme wind.
Yeah,
like a freight train going through.
And we are seeing that more often. And you look at the tornadoes that occurred in Kentucky the last couple of years. That is not something they were used to either. And so we've had tornado activity in West Virginia, which you used to think could never happen. You know, it is something that we got to be prepared for about anything, just never knowing what may be impacted.
One other thing, James, and this is so important. You know, I teach college. I like to mentor young people. Is there a program where a young person can perhaps explore a career in FEMA?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of FEMA careers, and there's never enough people if you look at the magnitude of disasters. But for somebody young, we have a program called FEMA Corps, which will give you that boots on the ground experience, getting deployments all across the country.
FEMA Corps?
FEMA Corps, CORP.
And where could a person access that web? Is that a
Yeah, you could get it on FEMA.gov, or just Google that term.
FEMA Corps.
Yeah, and it's for younger people who may not know exactly where they're heading in life, to get out there, to get some experience, and that really can help them if they want to pursue a career in emergency management, whether it's FEMA or state or local. It's great experience, and something that you cannot get in an internship or traditional route. So really encourage people to take advantage of that and look at it as an opportunity.
So there's a program called FEMA Corps. You can Google that and read about it, that lets you, through AmeriCorps, sign on and learn about FEMA as a young person.
Absolutely, and not just learn, but actually go out and help.
So go out and get boots on the ground, and like you did in 2016.
Absolutely, and during COVID, we had a FEMA Corps team here in West Virginia helping with the vaccination efforts, and you could be in some very austere conditions. You could be, you know, right after hurricanes hit or flooding. So you really see exactly what it means to work for FEMA, and then you get experience across all the different divisions. So you get a little taste of everything to understand exactly, you know, what direction you may want to go in a career with FEMA, which doesn't typically happen if you're just coming in, you know, out of the blue.
No, I'm sure if you sat down with a group of 20 young people and said, what career are you considering? I would be surprised if someone would say emergency management, even though it's a great career.
Yeah.
And in today's world, it's becoming a growing career and more important than ever career. It's always been important. James, as you move forward with your career, which congratulations on, I'm glad I've known you all these years. Yeah. Tell me your biggest challenge as you proceed with your career at FEMA.
So I think in a community or in a state like West Virginia, the topography is just the challenge, and we really focus on mitigation. And I think it's something that we could start at one end of the state and spend generations just trying to get caught up to make infrastructure more resilient, to make homes more resilient. And so that, to me, is the major challenge. Is we know it's going to continue raining and it's going to continue flooding.
And we can't get rid of the mountains.
Exactly. So how do we best build our communities and the infrastructure to prepare for that? And there are some great case studies of how people have improved stormwater systems or sewer systems, or if you look at flood walls that have been built over the generations, like that is all mitigation measures. And FEMA is putting a lot of money towards that, over $2 billion just in one grant every year.
Mm-hmm. I know there's a gigantic flood wall project in Milton right now.
Yeah. So I think it's going to take time, but that commitment and that funding and mitigation, I think, is going to really be what can change things. And I think also the preparedness, the flood insurance side, like those are all huge challenges in a state like West Virginia that has a lot of rural population. And so it's something that is going to take time. I think we're making progress, but it's also something that's not going to change overnight.
So it's being more proactive, less reactive, even though reactive is important when you have a disaster, and exploring mitigation. What role does keeping our creeks and streams clear, what role does that play?
I think in a state like West Virginia, where we have water all around us, and creeks and streams, one of the issues we run into with every single event is flood debris, some of which had been there for years, some of which is in there new. And it's an effort that everybody has to work together to try to solve, because not one agency is going to be able to remove all the debris. And it's also things like people not disposing of things in streams. You see the tires and things, and that just.
I have to say this because I'm so proud of this group. The Coal River group has removed over 10,000 tires.
It is
you heard
amazing.
that right, from the Coal River,
Yeah.
by hand.
Yeah.
Volunteers, over 10,000.
Yeah, and so things like that matter, and they get wedged up against the bridge, and if somebody's private bridge isn't elevated enough or isn't strong enough, that could create a blockage. So I think you got to look at it from that watershed perspective of everything's got to come down and eventually get to the river, but if there's debris or insufficient infrastructure along the way, that's just going to cause problems for everybody. And so I think people need to take that perspective of what I do in my yard or what I throw in the stream is going to affect the neighbor downstream from me.
James, you just said everything gets to the river. I still remember in the 7th grade learning that water always goes to the lowest point.
Yeah.
That's kind of the rule of everything.
Yeah.
But anyway, thank you for being here today, and congratulations on your career. You seem like you're really progressing, and you seem to be enjoying your career. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. I would love to come back anytime.
Well, thank you. I think I will have you back.
Right.
You might get on my rotating guest list.
Nice. Okay.
Keeping you informed on the Library Network about the importance of emergency planning in West Virginia, I'm Dave Hardy. Thanks for watching. Say What?